Moving to Stone Creek Estates was supposed to be a fresh start for Mike Carter, but there was one problem, and her name was Karen Whitmore. Mike had barely been in the neighborhood for a week before he noticed the first passive-aggressive letter, taped to his door. The envelope was marked, Urgent, HOA Notice. Frowning, he ripped it open. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that you are violating the HOA's strict community guidelines by parking a commercial vehicle in your driveway. This is unacceptable and must be resolved immediately. Failure to comply will result in fines and possible legal action. Respectfully, Karen Whitmore, HOA President Mike, let out a dry laugh. Wow. Didn't take long for the HOA to show its true colors. It didn't take long for Mike to learn that Karen was infamous around the neighborhood. And now, she had set her sights on Mike. Mike wasn't about to be bullied over something ridiculous. So instead of removing his truck, he did something even better. He parked it closer to the street. The next morning, right on schedule, Karen arrived. She strutted up to Mike's porch like she owned the place. "Mr. Carter," she greeted, her lips curled into a tight smile. Mike leaned against his truck. Karen's nose wrinkled at the sight of the matte black F-250 work truck parked proudly in the driveway. "This vehicle," she announced, waving her clipboard, "violates our HOA regulations." Mike crossed his arms. "How so?" Karen huffed. "It's an eyesore. A work truck has no place in a community like this. You need to remove it immediately." Mike smirked. "Yeah, that's not happening." Karen blinked rapidly, caught off guard by his lack of fear. "Excuse me?" she gasped. "You heard me," Mike said. "I just moved in and my truck stays." Karen's face twitched. "Mr. Carter," she said slowly, like he was a child. "Perhaps you don't understand. We have rules. The HOA exists to maintain order." Mike chuckled. "Funny. You sound less like a neighbor and more like a dictator." Karen's smile disappeared. "You'll regret this," she snapped. "I will be issuing fines, and trust me, no one beats the HOA." Mike watched her march away, shaking his head. She had no idea what she had just started. By the next morning, Mike found another violation notice in his mailbox, this time with a $500 fine attached. Mike rolled his eyes. This woman was really trying to intimidate him. But if Karen thought he would just roll over, she had picked the wrong guy to mess with. Later, that day, as Mike was washing his truck, he noticed an older man walking up his driveway. The man gave Mike a nod. "Name's Tom. Been in this neighborhood for about 15 years. Mike shook his hand. "Mike, nice to meet you," Tom smirked. "I saw Karen storming away from your house earlier. Let me guess, she's throwing a fit over your truck?" Mike laughed. "Bingo." Tom sighed. "Figures. She's been a pain in everyone's ass for years. You're not the first person she's harassed." Mike leaned against his truck. "Yeah? What happened to the last guy?" Tom chuckled. "He got tired of her nonsense and bought a house 2 blocks over, outside of HOA jurisdiction." Mike shook his head. "Well, I'm not running. She's gonna have to deal with me." Tom gave him a knowing grin. "She has no idea who she's messing with, does she?" Mike smirked. "Nope." And Karen? She was about to find out the hard way. Mike Carter had dealt with difficult people before, but Karen Whitmore, she was in a league of her own. After their first confrontation, he had hoped she'd move on and find someone else to terrorize. But nope, Karen doubled down. And now? She was about to make a mistake she couldn't take back. 2 days after Mike's first fine, a formal letter arrived. This time, it wasn't just Karen's signature. It was signed by the entire HOA board. "Dear Mr. Carter, your refusal to comply with HOA regulations regarding commercial vehicle restrictions has been noted. The continued presence of your truck is unacceptable. You have 48 hours to remove the vehicle, or we will be forced to take further action. Sincerely, the Stone Creek Estates HOA board." Mike scoffed. Further action? What were they going to do? Send in the HOA SWAT team? By the end of the week, Karen had managed to turn several neighbors against him. It was ridiculous. And then, one evening, as Mike was grilling in his backyard, his neighbor Tom stopped by again, this time shaking his head. "Karen's been going door to door," Tom said, sitting down on a lawn chair. Mike raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, trying to convince people I'm some kind of criminal?" Tom smirked. "Pretty much. She's saying your truck is bringing down property values, and that you're a danger to the community." Mike laughed. "Man, I didn't realize a parked truck could cause so much chaos." Tom sighed. "She's desperate, and when Karen gets desperate—" Mike leaned forward. "She does something stupid?" Tom grinned. "Exactly. And he wasn't wrong, because the next morning, Karen went nuclear." Mike woke up to pounding on his door. Not a knock. Pounding. When he opened it, he found Karen standing there, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched aggressively on her nose. Behind her, a tow truck. Mike blinked slowly. "Karen, what the hell is this?" Karen smiled sweetly in the same way. A snake might smile before striking. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. Since you have refused to comply with our requests, the HOA has no choice but to have this eyesore removed for you." Mike glanced at the tow truck driver, who looked incredibly uncomfortable. Then he grinned. Because Karen had just played herself. Mike folded his arms, watching as the tow truck driver walked up to scan the truck's plates. A few seconds later, the driver's eyes widened. Then he quickly backed away. Karen frowned. "What's the problem?" The driver cleared his throat. Ma'am? This truck isn't just a work truck," Karen scoffed. "Obviously it is. Just tow it already." The driver hesitated. Then Mike finally decided to enlighten her. Mike pulled out his wallet and flipped it open. Inside was a badge. A sheriff's department badge. Karen's smug expression froze. "This truck," Mike said slowly, enjoying every second, "is a department-issued vehicle. And I, Karen, am a sheriff's deputy." The tow truck driver immediately turned around and walked back to his truck. He was not getting involved in this. Karen's face turned ghost white. "Wait. What?" she whispered. Mike smirked. "That's right. I work as a mechanic for the sheriff's department. This truck technically belongs to law enforcement." Karen visibly swallowed. For the first time since this all started, she looked genuinely nervous. Before Karen could even process what she had just done, a few HOA board members showed up, clearly eager to watch the truck removal. One of them, a smug-looking man named Richard, stepped forward. "Is there a problem?" Richard asked. Karen turned to him, her voice a little shaky. He's a deputy." Richard blinked. "Wait. What?" Mike crossed his arms. "I'm a mechanic for the department, which means you guys just tried to tow a government vehicle." The HOA members immediately started whispering. Richard cleared his throat. "Well, surely we can work something out." "No," Mike said, cutting him off. "Because here's the thing. Not only is this truck not in violation of any laws, but what you just tried to do. That could be considered attempted theft of government property." Karen let out a strangled noise. Richard took a step back. Now, let's not escalate things." Mike pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. "Recording." "I already contacted the sheriff's office about this harassment," Mike said. "They told me to keep records of everything. And guess what?" He waved the phone. "I recorded this entire conversation." Karen staggered back like she had just been hit with a brick. You wouldn't." Mike smirked. "Oh, I absolutely would." Richard glared at Karen. "What the hell did you get us into?" Karen had no words. She had been so sure she was going to win. But now she had poked the wrong bear, and the sheriff's office was about to get involved. Karen Whitmore stood frozen, her smug confidence completely gone. She had spent weeks trying to get Mike's truck removed. And now she had just found out the hard way. The truck belonged to the sheriff's department, and Mike? He had recorded everything. For the first time ever, Karen looked nervous. "Wait," she stammered. Let's just calm down." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Calm down?" he repeated. You just tried to have my truck stolen. Karen swallowed hard. It was just a misunderstanding. Mike smirked. Oh, don't worry. I'll let my boss decide that. Then he dialed a number on his phone. Karen flinched. Mike put the phone on speaker. A deep, authoritative voice answered. Sheriff Davis. Mike spoke calmly, but firmly. Hey, Sheriff. Remember how you told me to record everything if the HOA harassed me? A pause. Yeah. What happened? Mike grinned at Karen, who was now sweating bullets. Well, he said, they just tried to have your truck towed. Silence. Then? The tone in the sheriff's voice changed. I'm on my way? Karen let out a choked noise. 15 minutes? Later, a black and white patrol SUV pulled up to Mike's house. Stepping out was Sheriff Tom Davis, a broad-shouldered, no-nonsense man in his early 50s. And from the look on his face, he was not in the mood for HOA nonsense. The second Sheriff Davis stepped onto the driveway. Karen tried to take control of the situation. Sheriff, she called out, plastering on a fake smile. I think there's been a little misunderstanding. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. Mike just folded his arms and waited. Karen continued spinning her web of lies. You see, she said sweetly, this gentleman's truck violates HOA guidelines, and we were just following procedure to… Cut the crap. Karen's mouth snapped shut. Sheriff Davis turned to Mike. You recorded everything? Mike nodded and played the recording. As the recording ended, the sheriff turned back to Karen. His expression was pure steel. Do you have any idea, he said slowly, what you just did? Karen forced a laugh. Sheriff, I think you're overreacting. No, he interrupted. I think you just committed a felony. Karen blinked rapidly. Felony? She whispered. Sheriff Davis nodded. Behind Karen, the HOA board members were now whispering nervously. Richard, the smug board member from earlier, stepped back. This wasn't my idea, he muttered. Karen, you didn't tell us the truck belonged to the sheriff's office. Karen spun around. Richard, don't you dare turn this on me, she snapped. Oh, I absolutely will, he shot back. You dragged the entire HOA into a legal nightmare. One of the other board members, a woman named Linda, stepped forward. Sheriff, I'd just like to say that the rest of the HOA had no idea Karen was doing this, she said quickly. We would never have approved it. Mike smirked. Karen was losing allies fast. Sheriff Davis took a deep breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. Finally, he looked at Karen. Karen turned red. You can't do this, she shrieked. I'm the HOA president, Sheriff Davis chuckled darkly. Not for long. Karen froze. What do you mean? The sheriff turned to the remaining board members. I strongly suggest you hold a meeting. Because if this woman stays in charge, she's going to get your entire HOA sued. Linda and Richard exchanged glances. Then? Richard nodded. I think it's time for a leadership change. Karen looked like she was about to pass out. As the sheriff wrapped things up, Karen stood in stunned silence. Mike walked up beside her, grinning. You know, Karen, he said, you were right about one thing. Karen turned to him, fuming. What? She snapped. Mike leaned in slightly. No one beats the HOA? He said, repeating her words from earlier. Then he smirked. Turns out the sheriff does. Karen Whitmore stood frozen, her HOA empire crumbling before her eyes. She was on the verge of losing everything. An hour after the confrontation, the HOA board members, minus Karen, held an emergency meeting in the neighborhood clubhouse. At the head of the room, Richard, the vice president, cleared his throat. Given recent events, he began, it has come to our attention that certain actions have put the HOA at risk of legal trouble. Karen shot up from her seat. This is ridiculous. I was protecting our community. Linda, another board member, sighed. Karen, sit down, she muttered. You're making it worse. Karen ignored her. We have rules, she shouted, waving her arms dramatically. If we let one man park his work truck, what's next? Boats? RVs? A junkyard? A neighbor in the back muttered, Lady, It's just a truck. Karen snapped her head around, seething. Then Richard dropped the bombshell. As of today, he announced, we are voting on whether Karen Whitmore should remain HOA president. The room erupted. This is a witch hunt, she shrieked. Linda folded her arms. Karen, you tried to tow a police vehicle. That's not a witch hunt, that's just stupid. Richard ignored Karen's outburst and raised his hand. All in favor of removing Karen as HOA president? Slowly, one by one, hands started going up. Karen's breath hitched. Then, more hands shot up. Within seconds, it was clear. She had lost. Richard nodded. That's it. Karen Whitmore is officially removed as HOA president. The room erupted in applause. Karen looked like she might explode. You can't do this, she shrieked. Mike, who had been quietly watching, finally spoke up. Actually, he said with a smirk, they totally can. Maybe you should have read the HOA bylaws before trying to break the law. The neighbors laughed. Karen? She stormed out, fuming, but she wasn't off the hook yet. Just as Karen reached her house, a black and white sheriff's SUV pulled up. Sheriff Davis stepped out, holding a document. Karen froze. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, walking up to her porch. Karen crossed her arms. What do you want now? The sheriff handed her the document. This is a formal notice, he said. You're under investigation for harassment, illegal towing attempts, and misuse of HOA authority. Karen gasped. Investigation? You have no right. The sheriff cut her off. You are not above the law, Karen. If we find any more violations, you will be facing charges. Karen's entire body trembled. And the neighbors? Karen Whitmore, once the self-proclaimed ruler of the HOA, was now just a disgraced ex-president. And Mike? He wasn't done yet. Karen Whitmore had lost everything, but karma wasn't done with her. Yet, because Mike Carter, he had one last surprise in store. A week after Karen's humiliating removal, the new HOA board held its first meeting. And this time, the neighbors actually showed up. Mike had never been interested in HOA politics. But after what happened, he wanted to make sure another Karen never took power again. So, when the new board asked for community input, Mike stood up. I think we should vote to remove half the ridiculous rules Karen put in place, he suggested. Linda, one of the new board members, nodded. Like what? Mike smirked. For starters, the no work trucks rule. The entire room burst into applause. Across the street, Karen was watching everything from her window. She could hear the cheering. She could see her former neighbors smiling, and she couldn't handle it. So what did she do? She called the HOA Richard, picked up, sighing. What do you want, Karen? Karen gritted her teeth. You can't just erase my rules. That's years of hard work. Richard laughed. Karen, we just erased you. Click. 2 days later, Sheriff Davis returned, and this time, he wasn't just handing Karen a warning, he was handing her a lawsuit. Karen stared at the papers in shock. What is this? She sputtered. Multiple homeowners, Davis said, have filed complaints against you for harassment, misuse of HOA power, and fraudulent fines. Karen's face turned ghost white. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm dead serious, the sheriff said. And if I were you, I'd get a lawyer. A month later, the neighborhood was completely different. She had been forced to sell her house to pay her legal fees. As Mike stood on his porch, grilling up some steaks, his neighbor Tom walked over. She's really gone, huh? Tom said, shaking his head. Mike grinned. Oh, yeah. And get this. Guess who bought her house? Tom frowned. Wait. Who? Mike laughed. The guy she tried to find for Christmas lights last year. Tom nearly choked on his beer. No way. Mike nodded. He's already planning to turn the front yard into a holiday wonderland. The two men clinked their drinks together, enjoying the peace and quiet. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was finally Karen-free. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. Don't forget to tap the bell icon to stay updated. Your support means the world.